All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening, organized by Radboud Reflects and the Radboud Green Office. As you may imagine, this is a green topic, and the Radboud Green Office was very happy to be involved. Tonight, the topic is the tremendous energy usage of our IT infrastructure and new technologies to reduce that energy usage, but also a critical discussion of whether or not we want to reduce the energy usage of these technologies, what sort of futures this unlocks. We'll be talking about this tonight with three speakers, more than our usual two. We have physicist Alexander Khajetoorians, who is the head of the Scanning Probe Microscopy, right? Scanning Probe Microscopy Department at the Institute for Molecules and Materials. So he is a physicist who knows a lot about the sorts of why IT technology uses energy. And he'll be explaining this to you all tonight. And afterwards we have Berber, who is an associate professor of organizational design and development, as well as social environmental scientist Sietske Veenman, who are both from the Nijmegen School of Management. And they will be introducing some some concepts required for us to have a critical discussion on the use and benefits of the sorts of technology that we're developing. The program tonight is that Alexander will kick off with a lecture about his research, and this will be followed by Berber and Sietske, who will be introducing the concepts that we'll then use to have a discussion with the three speakers and myself moderating about the usage of these technologies. And then, of course, at the end there will be room for questions from the audience. So if you do have some, save them for last, because there will be some room for you to ask them.
Well, with your topic, I'm just a management scientist, so it's a lot easier to understand what I'm talking about, maybe. So if I just go further, then I get my own slides. Are you sure? How does this work? So I'm also not technical now, you know.
You press the button on the right. That's forward.
Right, left, right. Good. You didn't talk about the carbon footprint anymore. My whole story is based on your carbon footprint. Okay. So now that we've learned from Alexander how much energy we actually use up by Googling whatever it is that we're looking for, I wanted to talk about, well, actually, Frank asked us to give some kind of other perspective on this green IT idea. And of course, we thought about it, and quite quickly, Sietske and I decided we're not going to say that we're against green IT, because that would be sort of a career suicide, I'm afraid. But what we could reflect on, which we also want you to invite you to reflect on, is whether we should actually want this, that we are capable of storing more data, exchanging more data, and what do we have to think of what I called our inexhaustible quest for data. Now, we hear a lot about that. We hear a lot about what we can do with data and when it's stored and when we transfer it and how digital technology will bring us further. We also hear a lot about what the concerns might be, which ethical issues we run into if we don't think about how we design this digital technology. And I don't know how many of you saw the interview with Harari of Adriaan van Dis. Anyone last week? None? Well, that is something you could still watch, I think, on NPO Start. We hear a lot about where we're standing. It's somewhere close to what might be. We're moving very fast into a direction in which AI robots and everything might take over everything that we do. In all these discourses that we hear, because it's not just one, we hear the pros and cons, we hear what is possible, we hear what the concerns are, and actually I don't really understand anymore. I have no idea what the future will bring. So I hope you didn't come here because you thought that we would give you a perspective of what it's going to be like. We have no clue either. You will not get a refund for your ticket, I'm afraid. But what I do want to know is where you stand on this. So I'm confused. I do know that there are different discourses, and I will take you through these discourses in a second. But before we do that, I would like to hear where you stand on this. So I created this proposition. And first I wanted to do this with this Mentimeter thing that you could type in your answer, and that would be fully anonymous, of course. But then I learned from Alexander what a waste of energy that is. And, you know, I'm not a physicist, I'm not even half as smart as Alexander, but I did figure out a way how to get your vote without using much energy. And if you do it very enthusiastically, you might even burn some calories. So then I also contributed to our health that's actually also deteriorating. Okay, so my position on this now, or the proposition that I want to pose to you is digital technology will enable us to overcome most issues currently limiting our progress. Now, I'm guessing many of you are scientists. Oh, you're already working with the cards, yes. Perfect. I anticipated that you would be scientists and that you would criticize me for the way that I came up with a proposition. With digital technology, I mean big data, AI, whatever you think of it, and with progress, whatever you want. Economic growth, health, inequality in the world, whatever. Okay, so I see a lot of people either without cards or they don't have a stake on this. I'm guessing... I would say red is disagree, yes. I was just going for this. You could also maybe stand up, but then, you know, that takes time and we don't have that. Okay, so I'm guessing most of you, I would say red is in the majority, slightly in the majority. Okay, so you're not that naive, that's a good thing. Okay. What did we vote about? What I would like, well, you know, if I ask my students, it would be green here, really. But they are a lot on the internet, but they don't actually know what they're getting into, is my opinion. Okay, so why did I create this proposition? Well, to give you a sense of the different discourses and the kind of propositions, assumptions and values that are the underlying thoughts and assumptions that these discourses have. And the way I would like to explain them is by using, I'm a management scientist, so I would like to make sense of the world by 2x2 matrices. Whenever it gets more than that, we get confused. So this helps. So 2 dimensions, epistemology and social order. Epistemology, there are two ways of understanding, because epistemology refers to knowledge about knowledge. So how do we establish that something qualifies as knowledge and not as a simple belief, for example? Well, there are 2 ways we can do that. It's either the objectivist dualism or practice-based duality, depending on which side. So if you are more on the objectivist dualism perspective, you believe that knowledge is either this or that. So it's either 0 or 1. It can't be both at the same time, and it's static. So we only measure this once, and then that's what it is. On the other side, we have the practice-based or the duality perspective. Scientists or philosophers on that side see knowledge as something that we socially construct. The right question here would not be what is knowledge, but when is knowledge? Because we think then that knowledge is something that's embedded in our doing, and so the question is, when do you actually see it happening? So here, this would be also something that's more cyclical and emergent, and here, of course, we do allow paradoxes to exist, and we actually love the contradictions because that gives us more explanation of what's happening. So that's one side of the 2x2 matrix. The other one is the social order. Hey, there's supposed to be a word that you can't see. Is this the pointer? Yeah. Here it says consensus. In my slides, those were wide. It was a little bit lower. But anyway, so that you know. So we have a dissensus side and a consensus side. The consensus side is, well, social order actually refers to how we think, what we think makes society tick. So what is the motor behind social order? And if you have a more of a consensus idea, to make it very simple, that would be the glass is always half full sort of idea of the world versus dissensus, glass is half empty. With the consensus perspective, we think that there should be or is mutual trust between people and that we will always strive for the common interest, that is what brings people further. And here, knowledge is something neutral. So it's either knowledge or it's not, and that's not political in any way. Well, you can guess then perhaps what a dissensus perspective would be on social order. Here, the motor behind social order in our society is actually conflict of interest. Whenever there's one interest that is dominated, another one, then we will always have people that are marginalized, and so other interests will not be heard, and then we will run into a new conflict. Knowledge here is political. So who decides what counts as knowledge, of course, is something very subjective. And from a dissensus perspective, that would be something that you're concerned about. Now, people in the consensus side do not say that there's no such thing as power or conflict, but they actually don't see it as the mechanism that pushes social order. So they do acknowledge that there is such a thing as conflict, but it's not what they normally see as what should be studied in their studies if it's for scientists. Getting back to our proposition, those of you who agreed with that digital technology will enable us to overcome most issues, which are currently limiting us, that would be perhaps a new functionalist discourse. I'm of course not completely sure, because I didn't hear all your nuanced understandings on that, but probably you think that technology is this one thing that will bring us further. We're not seeing it as something that is, for instance, connected to how people use technology. So we leave the human factor out. And there's a consensus idea. So we don't necessarily see any trouble. Or if we see some concerns, then that's something that should simply be overcome. Okay. Most of my research actually is on how digital technology affects healthcare practices, so the work of healthcare professionals, for example. And I've taken that as a background, as an illustration for these 4 discourses. So it's one and the same phenomenon, digital technology in a healthcare setting, but from different discourses you get a different look on what the underlying assumptions are, but also what the concerns and challenges are. So what we would see in a neo-functionalist discourse is, for example, that we think that digital technology will make our healthcare much less expensive, that it will be much more efficient and effective, that less mistakes will be made, because now it will be computers that actually store our data. That would be something that really fits with what we also refer to as technological determinism. So we think that technology is capable of solving all kinds of problems that we have. So the basic assumption here would be that data is a resource that's crucial for a competitive advantage. Now that's something that, of course, in healthcare is less important, but it is important to lower the costs as much as possible because healthcare becomes too expensive. Now, one of the concerns that they have, or the challenges that they see in this particular discourse, is how do we create new knowledge based on data? So they do acknowledge that just having a lot of data doesn't necessarily mean that you create competitive advantage. There are several steps in between, and one of them is that you have to create new knowledge, knowledge that's worthwhile, knowledge that you can use to actually get this advantage. I now still am on the consensus side, but now we move to the constructivist discourse. Here, the basic assumption is that digital technology shapes human agency and vice versa. So basically, on the social constructivist point of view, it would make no sense to really look at technology on its own and how it's designed, but we also have to take into account how people use it. And that's actually, as many of you know, often not how it was intended to be used by the designers. And the way we use it also inflicts something on the digital part of the technology. So we use it perhaps in different ways, and that ideally could be input to redesign the particular software or data or technology that we have. One of the concerns from this perspective would be, or the challenges actually, is how do we create an optimal affordance? How do we make sure that we use the digital technology or the data in such a way that it gives us exactly the kind of benefit that we were aiming for? Now, the example here is that you see an ambulance and what is supposed to be the emergency room of an ER, or at least the assistant that works with the data. Now, in ambulances, there is software. There are systems that show the people in the ambulance where there's room for their patient to bring them to. So which hospital in the neighborhood is actually capable of treating the patient that they have. Now, that would be perfect. I can imagine that people in the ambulance would want to know this. And of course, they do make calls and they do make sure that they drive to the right hospital right away. But this software is often not used. And the reason for that is because, especially in weekends, hospitals don't want to give up on their autonomy in knowing how many people will come into the hospital. Not because they don't have enough beds, that's something that the system says or could say, but because they have a shortage of healthcare providers. They don't have enough people, they don't have enough staff. So what they don't do is fill in the numbers of beds that are available, because that might mean that they have to come up with extra personnel that they can't find in the weekend. Okay, I'll take one tip in between. Okay, so we are now moving from the consensus side to the dissensus side, which is sometimes in the healthcare sector a bit harder to explain. The critical discourse looks very much up, so they're on the dualism side, and they have this, the glass is half empty idea of the world, right? So what they're thinking is, who actually owns the data? If we look at the healthcare sector, so all the knowledge and all the data that the hospital has of you actually belongs most of the time to Chipsoft, which is the provider of the databases that we use in healthcare in the Netherlands. The basic assumption for the critical discourse is who has access to the data, because this access actually is power. And it not only allows us to have access to the data, but it also gives the opportunity to learn from that data and to create new knowledge. So there is also a division of learning created according to a critical discourse. And who benefits? Well, most of the time, the capitalists. So the critical part also refers a bit to the Marxism idea of labor and capitalists making money from labor. The concerns and the challenges here is how to free human experience, so even us being sick, from it being translated into behavioral surplus. Those of you that are familiar with the work of Zsuzsanna Zuboff, also one of the guests in Tegenlicht last year, would know what that is. But so basically the digital trace that we leave, not only as patients with the data that they store about us, but also our buying behavior online, for example. So how do we free our human experience from it being translated into this behavioral surplus? And by turning that into prediction products, because you can be sure that Chipsoft is analyzing our data and actually feeding it back, and they're not doing this for free, I'm assuming, to the hospitals and to the doctors, because they can do all kinds of analysis with all this data that they have. So imagine a hospital first collected this data and then has to pay for it if they want to learn from this data. Okay, so that would be the critical discourse. These are their concerns. So they don't have this idealistic worldview of that everything will be for free. And then the final discourse is the dialogical discourse. So here, data or knowledge is not necessarily something that you have or you don't have, but it's actually something that is embedded in our doing. Everything that we consider to be normal, which we don't question anymore, is a way of exercising power, you could say. If no one ever questions it anymore, that's of course a very powerful thing. So what we see in healthcare here, how many of you have Fitbits or calculate the calories? Well, that might be a little bit of a too personal question. I started and I quit it within 2 days. It was too confrontational. But step calculators, anyone who used that? You could say you used it, you stopped, yeah? So some people do, okay. Well, I won't ask you for your personal experience with that, but what does happen is that at a certain point, the idea is that it self-disciplines you. That when you see that you haven't had enough steps, that you decide to take the stairs, that you do not take the elevator. I favor elevators, that's why. So there's a quantified self. It translates what we do into numbers, and then these numbers are fed back to us. And not just that, there are certain norms. Did you know that the amount of steps that you have to take per day is something that medical people certainly do not agree on? So who decided that, I don't know, how many steps do you have to take?
10,000.
10,000. 7 kilometers. Yeah, so that could be 10 or 700 meter. Who decided what the norm would be? We don't know. We often don't know. And this also might in the future be calculated by artificial intelligence or algorithms. And this becomes more and more obscured for us, what actually drives us and what pushes us into doing what we apparently have to do for ourselves. So these are the 4 discourses that we often hear. So you could place any topic that we have. So we have Amazon that tracks the productivity of their workers by giving them wristbands by which they are checked whether or not they're productive enough, for example. We actually nowadays have cows that wear Fitbits, and that actually helps to produce more milk because it's easier then to feed them in the right time, to provide the right temperatures. I mean, if you dive into it, there are many examples, many opportunities, many chances that we could use, that we could benefit from, and a lot of concerns as well. Okay, I hope that I've helped you a little bit with placing all these different voices that we hear and these different discourses and on certain matters now. I hope that you can understand where you come from, what the underlying assumptions are based on the social order and the epistemology. And I think it's important that we know this so that you are educated when you take part of the debate later on, but also in life. If we have to believe Harari, then when it concerns people at work, which is partly my field, you could say, we used to be over there, mostly humans did the work, and we were a little bit supported by digital technology, and then we moved very quickly. Oh. It's me and technology. Sietske, you're not the only one who has that problem. Of course, the dot should be on the line. Anyway, but you got my drift, right? So this is where it's moving very fast. And if we don't watch out, then, well, that's what the dystopian views and discourses say, then eventually the robot will send us home. And for some reason we find this problematic. You could say that gives us a lot of leisure time, but apparently we are more afraid that that will lead to all kinds of psychological problems with us not having any self-worth anymore. What we do want to talk about, actually, is what would be the optimal point. And I don't think that there's one point, but we need to think about in what way can we reap the benefits from what we're told that could happen based on digital technology or the data that we store and that we are capable of transferring more and more and use it. And where actually should we stop doing that and trying that, because we will have more disadvantages than advantages. I hope that this will help you, at least later on in the debate. And then I would like to give the floor to Sietske, who will help us make sense of that bright red dot. That's where I saw the link in our talks.
Die gaat door.
En dat is met het dingetje. Wijzer.
I think I'll manage. There we go. There we go. I hear myself quite loud, but you are probably used to this volume already. Green IT deserves a good thought of what it does for society or what it does with society in the future. You can approach this question by many different ways, and I like to approach it by thinking of futures. This is not a crystal ball, but it's an invitation to think wisely and informed about the future. Unfortunately, most of us lack the concepts to think about the future. So I'll enlighten you today, and we can think about what IT might do for our future, for our society together in the discussion. But first, I'll have a quick introduction about future thinking. In the ancient times, we used to think the future is fixed. If you want to know whether you're going to win a war, you went to the Pythia in the temple of Apollo, and she made a prophecy, and she would say, well, you are or are not going to win a war. Well, she wasn't that clear, but that's what the intention was. If she said you will not win the war, that was fixed. There was no way of winning it if she said you're not going to win the war. The future was fixed, it was determined. Later on, we sit on the other end of the continuum, and we thought the future is empty. And this was strongly felt around the beginning of the 20th century. For example, when we were making our polder, we were making Flevoland. We actually gained land from the ocean. We, humans, could do whatever. As usually the case when you are working with a continuum, you end up somewhere in the middle. So the futurists nowadays tend to think the future is open, yet not empty. You have to digest this maybe a little bit. We have choices. We can choose what we want to do up to a certain extent. There are certain rules, regulations, cultural traditions, institutions that define or shape boundaries to the choice that we have. But the future is open up to a certain extent. If we decide in the next elections, everybody in Holland, to vote on the Green Left Party, we will have a very different future than when we all decide to vote on an extreme right party, and I'm not going to mention names. But that will not instantly be the Netherlands that we've chosen for. So if we all start to vote for the Green Left Party, it will not be one nice, sustainable country the day after. We'll still have industries, regulations, subsidies, etc., that will delay to shape our future. So the future's open, yeah, we can do whatever, but it's not empty. In other words, and I really like this quote, is different futures are lurking in the present. And why do I like this quote so much? For two reasons. First, it emphasizes that the future is plural, futures. It's not one future, there are several futures we can pick from or we are shaping. And it makes a link to the present. And especially this link to the present, I want to elaborate a little bit with you today with three concepts. First is the making of futures, which means that we are in the process of creating futures at this very moment, in the present. The second is the using of futures. In our daily choices, we use the future more often than we tend to think, and the connection between the two. I'll go briefly over them one by one. So we're in the process of making futures. An example that I give my students when I explain something like this is, well, you've done your master thesis in a few months, and you've got 5,000 euros. And with this, you really want to travel the world, but you also really want to buy a car. So you're going on eBay, and you see this Tesla worth 80,000 euros, and you can have it for 4,000. And you think, that's the deal, I'm going to do this because this is great. So you buy the Tesla. At the moment that you bought the Tesla, you're not going to travel the world by train because you're an environmental scientist, if you're in my class. So you're not going to travel the world by train because it's too expensive. If you're not going to travel the world by train, you're not going to meet your future partner. You will end up all alone, miserably, with your cat and your Tesla. And that's a choice that you make now. So you're creating your future. I'm exaggerating a bit, of course. So right now, in the present, you make certain choices. I have to read the quote, but Napoleon already said, apparently, great events cast your shadow forward. So also choices that you make cast your shadow forward. Unfortunately, it's not very common to think this way. If this guy underneath, Cameron, thought a little bit longer when he decided to organize a referendum on the Brexit, he might not have done so. He was occupied with his own party and the future of his party, and not so much with the consequences that it could have for the future. So thinking about consequences the choices have now, what kind of future we're making, is not very common. Well, briefly, I don't want to do too much for the discussion afterwards, but briefly linking this to IT and a more efficient way of storing data, it can have great possibilities. Really, we can do whatever we want. We just heard that we can do with robots, and it will be great. At the other hand, if you have all this data stored, inevitably people are going to link it. And if they're going to link it, we might end up in a society, as is happening in China already now, that you get points for doing social activities. You get points for playing sports. Big Brother is watching you. Big Brother is giving you points for what you're doing. Is that a society that we want to create? If that's not a society that we want to create, should we invest in green IT, if the definition of green IT is cheap storage? So we're in the process of making futures, but we're also in the process of using the futures. An example, if you decide to put solar panels on your roof. I did put solar panels on my roof, and I was kind of an economic person then. I thought, okay, if I'm going to do it now, the policy that we get money back from the government will stay at least for 5 years. In this time, I end up and I'll make a profit out of it afterwards. There's a guy already here sitting and saying, no, 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 no. Other people might decide not to put solar panels on their roof because they think, well, the government isn't that consequent in the Netherlands anyway, so it might change, but also technology will improve, solar panels will get cheaper, they will be more efficient, so I'll wait a while. In the choice whether or not to put solar panel on your roof, one of the factors you're considering is the future. Also the money you have and other things, but also the future. Sometimes it is strategically done. We all know and we all accept probably the future of climate change, and that's done by humans. 97% of the scientists do. Some people deny this future for their strategic position in the present, right? Whether or not he actually believes or denies climate change, I don't think so, because he's a scientist. It's beside the point. The point is that he uses the future to gain power in the present. Luckily, there are also other people who do anticipate climate change and the way humans influence climate change by signing the energy agreement. That's what they show here. Once again, a brief glimpse to green IT. Green IT is great. If we think green IT is great, we assume that people will continuously increase to store data. As well, we think that if we make it cheaper or more efficient to store data, the eventual amount of energy we use will go down, right? If we make it more efficient to store data, then we can store more data and we use less energy. History has proven differently when the light bulbs were, the saving light bulbs were on the market. We thought, or the people back then, I was not thinking very much, I'm afraid then, but the people then thought that the saving light bulbs will save energy, and people would use less energy when lighting their house. But it turned out that people just use more light because it's cheaper. They leave the lights on. So where we think we anticipate the trend is not really like that. So if our actions today are influenced by using of future, and we create a future by what we're doing today, just thinking about the future is important, and the link between the two is important. And this is my last concept I would like to introduce. Narratives are the link between using of futures and making of futures. Let me explain with an example of an economist, Beckert. He did, I think already in 2015, research on German companies in China. And he said, well, in Germany, the story was continuously told that it was great business in China. It was easy, it was a big profit, the people were friendly. You really should go there if you want to get rich. So lots of German companies actually went to China. It turned out in China, it was not that easy after all. The language is really difficult. They didn't understand the culture. So it was difficult to be there. But the story in Germany was just ongoing that it was a good deal. Eventually, the Germans have quite a market share in China. So although the reality was different, this anticipation on the future that it's big business created a future in which Germany actually has a great market share. So there's the bridge between using of futures and making of futures. Then again, putting it to the green IT, you could imagine other trends than just continuously storing of data. You are all familiar probably with the Siri, the tool by the government in which they link data of people, like your history of your work, the traffic fines you have, your educational history, etc. And they link it, and then the system points out to certain people who are a high risk of fraud, right? And there was this bij voorbaat verdacht. I had to look it up. What's the English translation? Suspected from the outset is what you are. And they went to trial and they won. So the Dutch government is not supposed to do this anymore. But this is a fight over our future. Because if this trial was not won by this group, we might head towards China. So this trial in the present is actually a trial over our future. Another example is Facebook. Lubach, I think it was 2018 already, asked people to ban Facebook because of the intransparency they use data for. I don't think that this story was really picked up by everybody, but just imagine that it was picked up by everybody and Facebook was just wiped away. It would look different. It might sound like it's not realistic to think against the trend, but then I always have to think about the time I was working for the Scientific Council of Government Policy, and I met a lady, and she said, in 2005, I wanted to think about the future of the Netherlands when we were getting in an economic recession. And she said, my colleagues laughed at me. That will never happen, not anymore. And then she said, I wish I'd done that. That would be very good for my career, for the first time. And second, as Holland, we would have known what to do when we actually got into the recession, which happened, of course, a few years later. So if you think that this is such a strong trend, and, well, thinking opposite would be weird, then think about this story. I told you a lot. 3 different concepts, so what to remember, and I trust that the discussion, that these concepts will help in the discussion. We are in the process of making futures, so which futures are we creating? Are they desirable or not? Should we act different? The using of futures, what kind of futures are we anticipating? Are they realistic? What alternative futures or trends can you anticipate, and which narratives we hear, and then I link up with the discourses that Berber just told you, which stories are going around which might create a different future. Thank you very much.
Can I ask you to join us? Thank you very much, all 3 of you. I'm going to tie this together a little bit. And I'm going to start with Alex. Alex, so you make really small stuff. Why is it so small?
There's a lot of
There's
a lot of humor that I think humorous jokes I could make.
What's the benefit? Yeah.
What's the benefit? I mean, I think this goes along the lines of saying if you can store more stuff in a smaller space, so you have higher density, you could then in the end compute more or faster. So you could store more information, for example.
Store more information.
Yeah.
And it would take less energy, I guess, to move less stuff.
Maybe. Actually, the trend is the opposite. So you would actually think that if you make things smaller and faster, which means that you could compute more, you actually, in the end, let's say you have a unit and it dissipates heat, and now you have the same unit, because it dissipates the same amount of heat, but there's more of it in the same area, it dissipates actually more heat. And so actually, that's one of the trends that's been seen, is that as things get smaller and they get faster, they just start burning more energy in a more compact area.
All right.
So,
So I was under the impression that your research, you were working on methods for data storage that would not only be smaller, but also cost less energy.
That's true.
But now you're telling me that it making stuff smaller may not necessarily cost less energy.
So what I described to you was the old computational paradigm. So this is, for example, how silicon has evolved over the last, 50 years, which is that as things gotten smaller, it got faster, it costs more energy. Now we're saying something different, and I think there's a simple way of analogizing this. Like, the faster a computer can compute, you could probably multiply, I don't know how big of numbers much faster, but there's no common sense in it, right? So our brains, for example, do a lot of low energy computing, like guessing,
right.
And that can be more efficient.
Right. So it's not that you've now invented the concept of making stuff smaller to make it more energy efficient, because that's not true. You've invented a new way of storing data. That's what you told us.
Yeah. So hopefully, when you say me, you mean everybody that I've worked with.
Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
We've not only invented a way to store data, but we've also found a new way of processing it. So if you think about a computer, it calculates and then it stores the information somewhere else. This is separated, but our brains don't do that. You don't think about something and then download it into a USB stick, right?
Right. Yeah. So this is radically new. And tell us a bit more, because you mentioned this in your talk, what the relevance is of storing data and processing it. Because are you talking about me storing my vacation photos on my drive at home, or what is the level to which data-driven systems are prevalent in our lives? Yeah.
So I think to one extent we don't know what this will be used for. I think that we're at such the curiosity-driven level, and it's a question that's been linked by these two about should we actually drive that curiosity to a certain extent. So it's difficult to say what the application may be. On another hand, you can just simply say there are all these pattern recognition things that are going on out there. So I think we saw a few examples of the self-driving cars and the facial recognition. Should we not actually develop hardware that was built to do that more efficiently than what we already have?
Right. So there's lots of data-driven systems right now, and it looks like we'll be using much more of those sort of systems in the future. And you've just figured out a way to do all that much more efficient and much more green. So that's really cool.
Yeah, so I think there's two sides of that coin. So on the one hand, you could say, okay, like a self-driving car or whatever, this is massive energy consumption. In fact, if we built a robot that was cognate and stuff, the battery would, how quickly our phone batteries die, that thing would be dead before it turned on, right? And so by making these things more efficient, you may think you're solving the energy problem, but I subscribe to a lot of the things that were mentioned with like the light bulb, that we now just might multiply it and even use it more. And there's a good question to be asked, like how much light do we actually need in the room? And I think that's a question that scientists don't think about very much as they're trying to, and I think that this is a mandate on scientists in general, because we often believe we should pursue our curiosity, but there's an ethical question there. And moreover, if we don't do it, we think someone else will do it, right? And so there isn't this much thinking going on when we talk about this curiosity.
Okay. So Berber, I guess this is what you would call, so Alex's presentation kind of got stuck in what you call the neo-functionalist discourse, where he said, well, we want to do this sort of stuff, we want to have this sort of technology, let's just build a better machine, to put it bluntly, and then we can do whatever we want. And you say, well, that's one way of looking at it, but you kind of sketch different ways of talking about technological developments, or the ways of talking about the use of certain technologies.
Yes, and I could already see that Alexander picked something up, because I think that he also has a bit of a social constructivist perspective, and the same with the light bulb, of course. Those are all examples of we can develop the technology, but we are very bad in guessing how people will use it, and that can be in different ways. So either we leave on the lights, or we have more cars, but we simply queue up in the traffic jam, and so it won't bring us what we thought it would.
Yeah, and then even go one step further. So not only think, okay, maybe people will use more, but also what kind of society are you creating? And that goes beyond the frame that you're in. So if you think I'm going to have a new way of storing data because it's energy efficient and we use less carbon, which is great, of course, but you think only about the future of carbon and futures of what kind of society we're creating if we can store data and it's linked by the government, that's outside of the frame, but still important to think about.
And you already said that this is a task for scientists working on this technology.
So I feel a little bit torn, because scientists most of the time don't even know what they're doing, right? And it's the task of science is actually to figure out a lot of times what you've observed. So I'm not trying to say that we're running randomly, but so much of science is if things are explainable or predictable, it's actually most of the time not interesting science. And so already to go to the level of trying to now predict what the implications may be of something is actually maybe beyond one scientist. It's actually something of a community to talk about. That's the kind of discussions that probably aren't happening. Right. And so I think there's a nice example linked to what they've both mentioned is that I just heard this yesterday, but we know these examples of China where, you could say if you make greener IT, you would increase more facial recognition, how would this impact society? But then there are other countries, and this is the example I heard, like I think it's Estonia, that's actually saying, each individual has ownership of their own data, and they're actually told if the police checks your record, the actual owner of this data is notified each time. And so that's an interesting link to this futures not written kind of concept of saying, okay, there is a technology created, shouldn't we actually actively think as a community, as a society, basically how do human values interplay in this kind of digital age and trying to decide what some of these impacts are and not letting them dictate our behavior.
So this sounds like a bit like what Sietske was saying, that we need, or we can use a narrative, maybe a shared narrative, to kind of place what we're doing in some sort of image of what we want for the future, maybe. Is that something you would encourage? I guess, yes, you would encourage scientists to do this. Is this something you see, or?
Well, I think we see it all around, different narratives that would create different futures. I think it's an interesting question whether we should society leave up to decide what to do with it, or as a scientist yourself could say, hey, maybe this is this might lead up to a future that I don't want, so I'm going and do something else, and maybe someone else does it then. But yeah, well.
But that's not. So there's a different way of dealing with this that I got from your talk. Is saying that rather than thinking, well, if I don't do it, someone else will do it, create sort of a narrative that sketches maybe a future that we don't want, so that we can use this narrative, use this possible future to maybe steer people away from it.
I'm afraid that I'm follow.
So I think
don't we have these narratives already? I mean, we do have the concern stories, what I call the concern stories.
Yeah, it's like these dystopian futures.
This is what happens in China.
Look at China, for example. Yeah.
So that would be a narrative, I would say, that helps us make sense of what we want and what we don't want.
Well, I think these two, Facebook, when Lubach said we all have to ban Facebook because they're intransparent, we don't understand their algorithms, so we should stop it. That's an alternative narrative.
Sure, yeah. And maybe it's difficult to pit these narratives that are maybe a bit dystopian and scary against specific technological developments for which scientists are just saying, well, we just figured out this cool new thing, let's try it, right? And then to counter that with some sort of grand narrative, maybe
well,
difficult.
you could think about trends that are anticipated in this narrative. The one which is in English called, I can't remember, suspected...
Oh, yeah, okay.
That one, suspected from the outset.
Right.
They extend the trend of privacy, concerns about privacy. We shouldn't do that because it harms our privacy. Well, if you say great data storage might give great things, you extend the trend of storing data. So it's a different trend that you're extrapolating, where you build your frame upon, so you get a different narrative, which in turn creates a different future.
I think there's something to reply here. I know as a scientist that if you told me society should tell me what kind of science I would do, actually this has actually kind of happened recently in the Netherlands to some extent. People would, scientists get pretty frustrated by that. On the other hand, it's kind of a loop. Society's perspective on what science is doing is driven also by scientists also trying to promote their research or raise funding. Part of the answer to creating these narratives is just education, right? And so, driving not only better societal links to talk about impacts of research, but also just linking the different parts of the chains from science to scientific journalists to policymakers to society in general, about what some of the implications, also what we don't know, what some of the possible outcomes are, rather than thinking about how to make money from it or why this is the newest and greatest things, and actually have an open discussion about some of these things a bit more often. This is one of the things that doesn't happen enough, I would say.
Right, yeah. So you mentioned education. Yeah. So, for example, in middle schools, you gave this example where you have this a course in middle school where you learn how to wash your hair or something like that, like personal hygiene. And you said, why don't we have digital hygiene in high school? And maybe you learn some of these different discourses that you can take upon, like new technologies that are upcoming. Because yes, we don't know the future, so we can't really teach our children how to act in specific ways. But maybe we can teach them how to think in different ways about technology.
That's where I think the role of, maybe an academic is better suited, where we maybe don't always do the best job, right? And so it's difficult for somebody who's doing curiosity-driven research to go out in the world and say, okay, let me change the world. A lot of these questions about data is difficult for me to also answer. I don't know, right? But one thing that we do, and we're actually employed by university, is to think about innovations in education. And so if you go around and think about what high school was like for me, I was excited when I got somebody's phone number. That doesn't happen anymore, right? The ways in which we communicate and the ways in which we talk to each other have been all completely modified. And it's a good question to ask, how much does our curriculum actually reflect all these changes? Like the way people actually communicate with each other isn't even anymore on the telephone or face-to-face. And this is driving societal behavior, much like what was outlined earlier. And as scientists, or let's say academics, let's say in general, it's important for us to also think about how do we actually implement the knowledge that we've gained from experiments and from studies and feed this back through an educational platform via the university or via schools to educate people better. And this is something we could do better when we make new disciplines.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your perspectives on this, and thank you very much for coming. See you at the next Radboud Reflects.
Thank you.